By the end of his 5-year voyage, Charles Darwin began to reject the special creation hypothesis that God had created species and they had not changed since their creation. Darwin took up residence in this home south of London, and for the rest of his life would try to crack the puzzle of species change. He was convinced that species did change. The question was, how did they change? It was here in this house that he penned one of the most famous books in all of the history of science on the origin of species. And Darwin is going to reject the special creation hypothesis, and he's going to propose a mechanism for how species change. So the question for consideration was, what kind of process could change species over time? Now, Darwin quickly realized that it might be instructive to look at what humans have been doing for a very long time. After all, humans have changed many species. We have many forms of domesticated animals, and we've also used domestication in crops. And so Darwin thought it was instructive to study how humans had changed species and see if there wasn't some fertile clues for how nature might do it as well. Now, if we think about what humans were doing, they were doing a selection process. And Darwin began to appreciate the power of a selection process to change species. So what do breeders, animal breeders and plant breeders do? They select individuals based on a desired trait. They mate them and then examine the offspring for the desired trait and then repeat the process. So farmers might want to breed cow to make more milk, or pig to make more meat, or horses to be fast, or dogs to have all variety of shapes, and plants to have all kinds of characteristics, whether they grow bigger, or they're more drought resistant, or tolerant of pests, or whatnot. So Darwin was very interested in what animal and plant breeders were doing. They were selecting individuals with desired traits and preferentially allowing only them to mate, and the characteristic of interest then would be represented in the offspring, and you could repeat that process. And over time, plant and animal breeders were changing species. And so Darwin thought, well, if humans can do this fairly simply, perhaps there is a mechanism in nature that can change species as well. Now, he's going to call this process natural selection. But it raised some questions. What is doing the selection? Some process in nature must be performing some kind of selection like humans were doing on the farms. How could it work? So in this lesson, we'll take a look at Darwin's reasoning for the process that has the power to change species. Now, to understand Darwin's reasoning, we're going to use a specific example. We'll use the example of the evolution of stick insects from ancestors that did not look like sticks. So Charles Darwin is going to argue the stick-like bodies that we see today in some of these species is an adaptation. It's a species-wide adaptation, and its function is to provide camouflage from predators. But Darwin's going to argue these stick insects did not always look like sticks. Their ancestors presumably did not look like sticks, and so some process must have changed the species over time, giving them a new sort of camouflage trait here, the thin body that looks like a stick. So we'll use this example to go through Darwin's reasoning, how he arrived at the process of natural selection. First, let's introduce you to some stick insects. Here is a rather large species from Malaysia. Here's the head and the eyes. Notice the little sort of thorny-like things on the legs. Here we see some pictures of stick insects in their habitats. So here's one here on a leaf, here's one on a stick, and here's one hanging from some twigs. Here's one perhaps on the forest floor. So we'll use the stick insect to illustrate Darwin's reasoning. Now, we're going to encounter several facts that Darwin will ponder, and then Darwin's going to make some inferences. Let's take the first 3 facts. Facts 1, there is a potential rapid increase of any population, and this is because parents usually have more offspring than would replace the parents when they die. So for 2 stick insects, mom and dad, they're going to lay many more eggs than just 2. So there's a potential rapid increase of the population. Yet populations appear to remain fairly constant in nature. So this is another typical observation that any naturalist would make. We're not overrunning with stick insects. So there's another fact, of course, we can witness easily, that there are environmental factors that limit populations. We often see predators eating their prey, and that will be a limit to population growth. Here we see a bird that has captured a stick insect. So these are three facts that everybody was aware of. So these are not unique to Darwin. Darwin didn't make these observations alone. Everybody knew about them. Now let's look at these three facts in context, in the context of our stick insects. Now we're going to use a bracket diagram like this to illustrate this process. So here's our parent insect. Now this insect parent has more than the replacement number of offspring, creating the potential for exponential growth of the population. We'll indicate that by showing 3 offspring over here. Now this would be the mother who lays the eggs, but we're assuming the mom has already mated with a male, and she is now producing more than a replacement number of offspring. Yet, when we look out in nature, we do not see an explosion of stick insect populations. And how could this be? So clearly, then not everybody, not all the offspring are surviving. And the idea is, of course, some are eliminated by predators or a lack of food or disease. All kinds of things in nature can reduce population size. Now, Darwin's then is going to make his first inference here from these 3 facts, from facts 1, 2, and 3, that there is a struggle for existence in nature. There are more offspring produced each generation than can possibly survive to reproduce. Metaphorically, nature is a battlefield with massive amounts of death. So back to our diagram here, the idea is that not all of these offspring are going to survive. Some are going to perish before they can become parents, and we call this then the struggle for existence. Now they're not sort of literally struggling. That's a metaphorical term. It could be predators or disease or climate that can take you out, but if not everybody makes it to reproduce, we're saying there's a struggle for existence. Darwin now is going to ask a very important yet simple question: who will win the struggle for existence? And his answer relies on fact number 4. Individuals in a population show variation in traits. Again, this was known to everybody, but Darwin saw a significance in this fact, whereas others overlooked it. In a natural population, not every individual is identical. There are variations in their characteristics or traits. Now, we know today that it is DNA mutations and the mixing of genes during sexual reproduction that produces a lot of this variation. DNA was unknown to Darwin, but Darwin could see the variation. He just didn't know how reproduction really happened. He did not know about DNA. So this is important because some individuals have variations in traits that make them more likely to survive than others in their population. That's the key. That's the significance of variation. These are differences that might make a difference to survival. And so when we think about these ancestors of the stick insects, we've got variation in body shape. That variation in body shape might make a difference to survival. So Darwin's asking, who's going to win the struggle? Well, that depends on the context of the species. Does it matter if you're a little thinner or a little thicker? Why would there be an advantage to a thin body, for example? Well, consider the story of the stick insects then. An ancestral population of insects that did not look like sticks take up residence in regions with lots of sticks. So here the idea is, if you're living amongst lots of sticks with predators that are going to eat you if they see you, it might be the case that if you look a little bit more like a stick, the predator might not see you. And so Darwin's going to argue that any slight advantage in camouflage might make a difference to survival. On our bracket diagram, it would mean that the thinner individual would be the winner in the struggle for existence. There are unequal chances of survival here based on the variation in the body shape. So in this case, in an environment filled with sticks, the thinnest body shape would be the trait best fit to that environment. We would call them then the winner in the struggle for existence. In other words, the thinner bodied insects simply over time will tend to have more babies than individuals that were eaten by predators, for example. Now, Okay, so some win, the thinner ones win. So what? Well, now fact 5 comes into play. Much of the individual variation in animals and plants is heritable. That is, a trait that can be passed on to its offspring. Now, Darwin knew this from the success of animal and plant breeders. You can only breed cows to produce more milk if milk production has some heritability. Right? You can only breed crops to be more drought resistant if there is some heritable feature of the plant that makes it resistant to crops. So the success of animal and plant breeders meant that much of this variation was in fact heritable. Now we know that today the traits that are encoded in DNA are the heritable ones because DNA is the hereditary molecule. But again, Darwin did not know about DNA. So why is it significant that somebody wins the struggle for existence? Because the winners become parents. So in this diagram here, the thinner insect here is the winner in the struggle, so they will tend to have more babies than others that might have been eaten. Now, when the winners get to be parents, they're going to be passing on their traits to their offspring. So beneficial traits are preferentially passed on to offspring. In this case, the thinner body is the beneficial trait, and so the parent's offspring are going to inherit the thinner body. The most common offspring, so the thin body will be the most common of the offspring. However, there will be some new variation. So again, mutations and sex produce new variations. But most of the offspring will inherit the parental trait, but there will be some new variation as well. Notice, though, that because most offspring inherit the winner's traits, overall the next generation's body shape is a little thinner than the previous generation's body shape. And again, then the process will continue. For this generation, there is a struggle for existence. Too many individuals are born to possibly survive and reproduce. Predators are going to be eating some of these insects, and they're going to be eating the ones they see. Again, any kind of variation that provides better camouflage will be favored, right? So that those individuals will have a better chance at survival. Now, in this slide, we're indicating the significance of heredity in preserving the favored traits. So let's take here's the winner in this generation. Here's the winner of the struggle for existence. It just means that they tend to survive more than the others because they have better camouflage. If there were no heredity, then that thin body trait would not be overly represented in the next generation. You see, if the thin body trait is not hereditary, then we would expect a parent to simply have the next generation that kind of looked like the previous generation. Whereas if there is heredity, the thin body trait is being passed on. Most individuals will inherit that trait with some new variation. But notice again that when there is heredity, the next generation will tend to have thinner bodies than the previous generation. So we've got two really important forces going on. We've got forces that generate variation in individuals, and then we've got heredity that is preserving the useful variations. We're now ready to see Darwin's groundbreaking inference. It's inference number 2, and the inference is going to be natural selection. So given the context of a struggle for existence, that was inference 1, and the observation of heritable variation in populations, which influenced survival, from facts 4 and 5, Darwin concludes that the most fit traits will become more frequent in future populations. And he's going to call this process natural selection. And this process is causing species to change, to become better adapted to their environment. As the most stick-like body shape is selected each generation, the trait becomes more frequent in the population and can even improve. So again, here we see at some stage in the evolution of the stick insects, they are looking thinner than their ancestors. Here we have the winner of the struggle. They will tend to have more babies, and over time then the thin body trait is going to become more and more common in the population, and it will get even thinner as new mutations arise. So we're going to end up then with a population of stick-like insects. And just to clarify, the trait that is selected in this case is the trait that gives an advantage to some individual over another individual. It is predators that are, in a sense, doing the selecting by eating the ones they see. Those predators are selecting the better camouflaged insects to survive and pass on that useful trait. So Charles Darwin is going to argue that adaptations, these features of creatures that help them survive, these adaptations are caused by the process of natural selection. So over time, natural selection causes the evolution of adaptations. Useful variations will increase in future populations, and this is evolution. So evolution refers to the fact that there's a change in the frequency of certain traits in a population over time. Natural selection is causing an increase in these favored traits, because the parents with the favored traits are having more babies. And it's important to note that individuals do not evolve. It is populations that evolve. So in other words, you're just sort of born into the world with whatever traits you have. It's the population that is evolving, not an individual. An individual doesn't get thicker or thinner over its lifetime, although, of course, we know that humans can get larger or thinner or whatnot. But that's not sort of how it's working in nature here. This process is operating on variation that is genetic, that is hereditary in nature. So individuals don't evolve, but populations do. Now, the useful trait, in this case, the thin body, that provides camouflage, is called an adaptation, and adaptations can improve over time as new variations are produced each generation. In time, the adaptation becomes a species-wide characteristic, something most members of the population have. So Darwin appreciated the power of a selection process. He saw human selection creating changes in animals and plants, and it was his insight to see that out there in nature a selection process was also happening, and it had the power to change species over time. It's just that what was happening in nature is a natural process. It was not driven by humans. There was no intelligent process picking which traits survive. It was an interaction between predators and prey, for example, that was driving this evolutionary change. And so Darwin then is going to reject the special creation hypothesis, which said that species were created by God and they hadn't changed since. Remember, the Christian thinkers would argue that God had created the stick insects. They always looked like stick insects. And Darwin is saying, no, that's not the case. They had ancestors that did not look like sticks. This means that species can change over time. They are not fixed. To recap Darwin's reasoning then, we have fact 1, 2, and 3 led to the inference that there's a struggle for existence, and this struggle, in combination with fact 4 and 5, leads to the inference of natural selection. Now, Darwin argues that natural selection has the power to change a species to make them more fit to an environment. So we saw this in the example of the stick insects. They evolved more stick-like bodies for camouflage. But he's going to go on to also argue that natural selection is instrumental in the creation of new species. So one species can evolve into two separate species. And he's going to argue that when members of one species get separated into different environments, natural selection favors different traits. In time, the separated populations become two distinct species. This is one mechanism for how one species can become two. Some kind of isolation, some factor, some force that is going to separate one species into different environments. Now we're going to just use a cartoon example here, back to our insects. Imagine the ancestral population that did not look like sticks. They get separated into two very different environments. Some go into the stick-like environment, some go into the leafy environment. Well, if we understand natural selection, then we know then predators are going to be eating the insects in both these environments, but the camouflage characteristics will be different for these environments. So it's better to look like a leaf up here amongst the leaves, better to look like a stick amongst the sticks here. So natural selection will be favoring different body shapes in these different environments. So over time then, we're going to get different adaptations. So this population will evolve leaf-like bodies, and this population will evolve stick-like bodies. And if long enough time elapses, these two populations may no longer be able to reproduce with each other, and so we would call them two separate species. There are actual leaf insects, and they look like this. So this is a real leaf insect. Here's the insect, here's some leaves here. Notice the detail in these organisms. They really do have excellent camouflage. So here's a magnification of the back part of the insect, and it really has, look at all that detail of a leaf. So Charles Darwin's book is one long argument against the special creation hypothesis. He gathers many observations that species are not fixed, they can change. And there are lots of different kinds of observations, from the fossil record to the geographic distribution of species, for example, in the Galapagos Islands and other oceanic islands, to comparative anatomy and embryology and the classification of species, that organisms have groupishness. We can group them into categories, argues Darwin. That's all explained by the idea that species are not fixed. They can change. So notice then, this is in contrast to earlier thinkers who would have put the origin of species in the mind of God, that it was God that created species, and they hadn't really changed very much. And Darwin is going to reject this notion. Darwin's going to say that species have a natural origin, and it is natural selection that is the key process. And so for Darwin, then, he's proposing then a mechanism for species change. Natural selection, at the time, we'll call this an inference, so it's a conclusion based on observations, but nevertheless, today we have lots of evidence that natural selection is occurring. So Darwin in this book is laying out two things, arguing that species did in fact change, and then proposing a mechanism, natural selection, for how species change. And so, in this home outside of London was born one of the greatest ideas in all of science, that species have natural origins, and that a natural process has the power to make species better fit to their local environments, and in fact to multiply species over time.